Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for tuning in today. This is the Bodega Cat Book Club Financial Edition, and we are continuing our reading of The Creature from Jekyll Island by G. Edward Griffin. And this is the 5th edition. Here we go, 5th edition. And today we'll be starting with chapter 3, and this will be part 1. Okay, let me move the camera in just a little bit so you guys can see better. If you got your own book, you can follow along. If not, you can watch our YouTube channel on the screen as well. Whatever works for you. All right, here we go. Chapter 3, Protectors of the Public. The bailout game is applied in real life to Penn Central, Lockheed, New York City, Chrysler, Commonwealth Bank of Detroit, First Pennsylvania Bank, Continental Illinois, and beginning in 2008, literally all major banks, AIG, automobile companies, and even banks of other nations. In the previous chapter, we offered the whimsical analogy of a sporting event to clarify the maneuvers of monetary and political scientists to bail out those commercial banks that comprise the Federal Reserve cartel. The danger in such an approach is that it could leave the impression the topic is frivolous. So let us abandon the analogy and turn to reality. Now that we have studied the rules of the game, it is time to check the scorecard of the actual play itself, and it will become obvious that this is no trivial matter. A good place to start is with the rescue of a consortium of banks that were holding the endangered loans of Penn Central Railroad. Penn Central. Penn Central was the nation's largest railroad with 96,000 employees and a weekly payroll of $20 million. In 1970, it became the nation's biggest bankruptcy. It was in debt to just about every bank willing to lend it money, including Chase Manhattan, Morgan Guarantee, Manufacturers Hanover, First National City, Chemical Bank, and Continental Illinois. Officers of those banks had been appointed to Penn Central's board of directors as a condition for obtaining funds, and they had acquired control over the railroad's management. The banks also held large blocks of Penn Central stock in their trust departments. Bankers sitting on the board of directors were privy to information long before the public received it that would affect the market price of Penn Central stock. Chris Wells, in The Last Days of the Club, describes what happened. On May 21st, a month before the railroad went under, David Bevan, Penn Central's chief financial officer, privately informed representatives of the company's banking creditors that its financial condition was so weak it would have to postpone an attempt to raise $100 million in desperately needed operating funds through a bond issue. Instead, said Bevan, the railroad would seek some kind of government loan guarantee. In other words, unless the railroad could manage a federal bailout, it would have to close down. The following day, Chase Manhattan's trust department sold 134,300 shares of its Penn Central holdings. Before May 28, when the public was informed of the postponement of the bond issue, Chase sold another 128,000 shares. David Rockefeller, the bank's chairman, vigorously denied Chase had acted on the basis of inside information. And that quote was from Chris Wells, The Last Days of the Club, New York, E.P. Dutton, 1975, page 398 to 399. Virtually all of the management decisions that led to Penn Central's demise were made by or with the concurrence of its board of directors, which is to say by the banks that provided the loans. The banks were not in trouble because of Penn Central's poor management. They were Penn Central's poor management. An investigation conducted by in 1972 by Congressman Wright Patman, chairman of the House Banking and Currency Committee, revealed the following. Banks provided large loans for disastrous expansion projects and then lent additional millions so the railroad could pay dividends to stockholders. This created the false appearance of prosperity and inflated the price of its stock long enough to dump it on the unsuspecting public. Thus, the banker managers engineered a three-way bonanza for themselves. They, one, received dividends on worthless stock, two, earned interest on loans that funded those individuals, and three, were able to unload 1.8 million shares of stock after dividends, of course, at unrealistically high prices. And that was from Penn Central, 1971, Congressional Quarterly Almanac, Washington, D.C., Congressional Quarterly, 1971, page 838. The company's top executives disposed of their stock in this fashion at a personal gain of more than $1 million. And that was from Penn Central, bankruptcy filed after loan bill fails, 1970, Congressional Quarterly Almanac, Washington, D.C., Congressional Quarterly, 1970, page 811. The public be damned. In his letter of transmittal accompanying the staff report, Congressman Putnam provided the summary. It was as though everyone was part of a close-knit club in which Penn Central and its officers could obtain, with very few questions asked, loans for almost everything they desired, both for the company and for their own personal interests. Where the bankers sitting on the board asked practically no questions as to what was going on, simply allowing management to destroy the company, to invest in questionable activities, and to engage in some cases in illegal activities. These banks in turn obtained most of the company's lucrative banking business. The attitude of everyone seemed to be, while the game was going on, that all these dealings were of benefit to every member of the club, and the railroad and the public be damned. And that was from, quoted by Wells, page 404 and 405. The company's cash crisis came to a head after over a weekend. And in order to avoid having the corporation forced to file for bankruptcy on Monday morning, Arthur Burns, the Fed chairman, called the homes of the heads of the Federal Reserve banks around the country and told them to get the word out immediately that the system was anxious to help. On Sunday, William Trieber, who was the first vice president of the New York branch of the Fed, contacted the chief executives of the 10 largest banks in New York and told them the Fed's discount window would be wide open the next morning. Translated, that means the Fed was prepared to create fresh money and lend it to commercial banks so they, in turn, could multiply and re-lend it to Penn Central. And there's a footnote on that. For an explanation of the multiplier effect, see Chapter 8, the Mandrake mechanism. The interest rates for these funds were low enough to compensate for the risk. Speaking of what transpired on the following morning, Burns boasted, "I kept the board in session practically all day to change Regulation Q so that money could flow into CDs at the bank." Oh, interesting. Regulation Q. I wonder what that is. Looking back at the event, Chris Wells approvingly describes it as what is by common consent the Fed's finest hours. That was from Wells, page 407, 408. Interesting, eh? Matter of perspective. They feel like it's a good thing. The bankers feel like it's a good thing that they did. But on the Penn Railroad side, it wasn't. Finest or not, the banks were not interested unless they could be assured the taxpayer would co-sign the loans and guarantee payment. So the action inevitably shifted back to Congress. Penn Central's executives, bankers, and union representatives came in droves to explain how the railroad's existence was in the best interest of the public, of the working man, of the economic system itself. The Navy Department spoke of protecting the nation's resources. Congress, of course, could not callously ignore these pressing needs. It ordered a retroactive 13.5% pay raise for all union employees. After having added that burden to the railroad's cash strain and putting it even deeper into the hole, it passed the Emergency Rail Services Act of 1970, authorizing $125 million in federal loan guarantees. And that bill was from Congress Clears Railroad Aid Bill, Acts on Strike, 1970, Congressional Almanac, Washington, D.C., 1970, page 810 to 816. None of this solved the basic problem, nor was it intended to. Almost everyone knew that eventually the railroad would be nationalized, which is a euphemism for becoming a black hole into which tax dollars disappear forever. This came to pass with the creation of Amtrak in 1971 and Conrail in 1973. Amtrak took over the passenger services of Penn Central, and Conrail assumed operation of freight services. Conrail is a private corporation. When it was created, 85% of its stock was held by the government. The rest was held by employees. Fortunately, the government's stock was sold in a public offering in 1987. Amtrak continues under political control and operates at a loss. By 1998, Congress had given it $21 billion. By 2002, it was consuming more than $200 million of taxes per year. By 2005, it requested an increase in subsidy to $1.8 billion per year. Between 1990 and 2009, it had lost another $23 billion. Conrail, on the other hand, since it was returned to the private sector, has been running at a profit, paying taxes instead of consuming them. Lockheed. In 1970, the Lockheed Corporation, the nation's largest defense contractor, was facing bankruptcy. The Bank of America and even smaller banks had lent $400 million to the Goliath and did not want to lose the bountiful income that flowed from that. So they joined forces with Lockheed's management, stockholders, and labor unions and descended on Washington. Sympathetic politicians were told that if Lockheed were allowed to fail, 31,000 jobs would be lost, hundreds of subcontractors would go down, thousands of suppliers would be forced into bankruptcy, and national security would be seriously jeopardized. What the company needed was to borrow more money, and lots of it. But because of its current financial predicament, no one was willing to lend. Seems like it's the same excuse and same story over and over again. A bailout plan was quickly engineered by Treasury Secretary John B. Connolly that guaranteed payment on an additional $250 million in loan, an amount which would put Lockheed 60% deeper into that hole than it had been before. But that made no difference now. Once the taxpayer had been made a co-signer to the account, banks had no qualms about advancing the funds. The government now had a powerful motivation to make sure Lockheed would be awarded as many defense contracts as possible, and that they would be as profitable as possible. This was an indirect method of paying off the banks with tax dollars, but doing so in such a way as not to arouse public indignation. Other defense contractors, which had operated more efficiently, would lose business, but that could not be proven. Furthermore, a slight increase in defense expenditures would hardly be noticed. New York City. In 1975, New York had reached the end of its credit rope and was unable to make payroll. The cause was not mysterious. It had become a mini welfare state, and success in city politics was achieved by lavish promises of benefits and subsidies for the poor. Whereas the average large city employed 31 people per 1,000 residents, New York had 49, and their salaries outstripped those in private industry. While an X-ray technician in a private hospital earned 187 per week, the porter working for the city earned 203. Bank tellers earned $154 per week, but change makers on the city subway received 212. Municipal fringe benefits were twice as generous as those in private industry. On top of this were free college educations, subsidized housing, free medical care, and endless varieties of welfare programs. City taxes were greatly inadequate to cover the cost of this utopia. There now were only three options: increase city taxes, reduce expenses, or go into debt. The choice was never in serious doubt. By 1975, New York had floated so many bonds, it had saturated the market and could find no more lenders. $2 billion of this debt was held by a small group of banks dominated by Chase Manhattan and Citicorp. When the payment of interest on these loans finally came to a halt, it was time to play the bailout game. The bankers and city fathers traveled down the coast to Washington and put their case before Congress. The largest city in the world could not be allowed. Same old story. Could not be allowed to go bankrupt, they said. Essential services would be halted and millions of people would be without garbage removal, without transportation, even without police protection. Starvation, disease, and crime would run rampant through the city. It would be a disgrace to America. David Rockefeller at Chase Manhattan persuaded his friend Helmut Schmidt, Chancellor of West Germany, to make a statement to the media that the disastrous situation in New York could trigger an international financial crisis. Congress did not want to bring anarchy to New York, nor to disgrace America, nor to trigger a worldwide financial panic. So, in December of 1975, it passed a bill authorizing the Treasury to make direct loans to the city up to $2.3 billion, an amount which would more than double the size of its current debt to the banks. Interest payments on the old debt resumed immediately, which is the object of the game. New York City has continued to be a welfare utopia, and it is unlikely that it will ever get out of debt. Chrysler. In 1978, the Chrysler Corporation was on the verge of bankruptcy. Oh my gosh, I could hear the broken record, going over and over and over and over. That's too funny. Well, not funny, but sad, but kind of funny in a way. By 1978, the Chrysler Corporation was on the verge of bankruptcy. It had rolled over its debt many times, and that phase of the game was nearing an end. It was not interested in borrowing just enough to pay interest on its existing loans. To make the game worth playing, it wanted over $1 billion in new capital. Managers, bankers, and union leaders found common cause in Washington. If one of the largest corporations in America was allowed to fold, think of the hardship to thousands of employees and their families. Consider the damage to the economy as shock waves of unemployment move across the country. Tremble at the thought of lost competition in the automobile market if there were only two major brands from which to choose instead of three. I'm sorry, that just sounded so hilarious. Oh my gosh, I'm having a laughing moment. I'm sorry, everybody. Okay, calm down, Christine. Could anyone blame Congress for not wanting to plunge innocent families into poverty, nor to upend the national economy, nor to deny anyone their congressional right to freedom of choice? So a bill was passed directing the Treasury to guarantee up to $1.5 billion in new loans to Chrysler. The banks agreed to write down $600 million of their own loans and to exchange an additional $700 million for preferred stock. Both of these moves were advertised as evidence the banks were taking a terrible loss, but were willing to yield in order to save the nation. Save the nation, like a fake Superman, right? With a fake cape and a fake whatever. It should be noted, however, that the value of the stock, which was exchanged for previously uncollectible debt, rose drastically over the settlement after the settlement was announced to the public. Furthermore, not only did interest payments resume on the balance of the old loans, but the banks now replaced the written down portion of fresh loans. And these were far superior in quality because they were fully guaranteed by the taxpayers. Commonwealth Bank of Detroit. The next bailout occurred in 1972 involving the $1.5 billion Bank of the Commonwealth of Detroit. I can hear the broken record again. Oh boy. Commonwealth had funded most of its phenomenal growth through loans from another bank, Chase Manhattan in New York. When Commonwealth went belly up, largely due to security speculation and self-dealing on the part of its management, Chase seized 39% of its common stock and actually took control of the bank in an attempt to find a way to get its money back. FDIC Director Sprague describes the inevitable sequel. Chase officers suggested that Commonwealth was a public interest problem that the government agencies should resolve. That unsettled hint was the way Chase phrased its request for the bailout by the government. Their proposal would come down to bailing out the shareholders, the largest of which was Chase. And that was from Sprague, page 68. The bankers agreed that Commonwealth must not be allowed to fold because it provided essential banking services to the community. It was justified on two counts. One, it served many minority neighborhoods. And two, there were not enough other banks in the city to absorb its operation without creating an unhealthy concentration of banking power in the hands of a few. The FDIC did not want to be accused of being indifferent to the needs of minorities or of destroying free enterprise competition. Oh no, God forbid. So on January 17th, 1972, Commonwealth was bailed out with a $60 million loan, plus numerous federal guarantees. Chase absorbed some losses, but those were minor compared to what would have been lost without FDIC intervention. Since continuation of the bank supposedly was necessary to prevent concentration of financial power, FDIC engineered its sale to the First Arabian Corporation, a Luxembourg firm funded by Saudi princes. The bank continued to flounder, and in 1983, what was left of it was resold to the former Detroit Bank and Trust Company, now called Comerica. Oh, that sounds familiar. Comerica. Wasn't Comerica in one of Tom Cruise's movie? I think it's called Made in America. I'm not sure. I don't remember, but Comerica sounds awfully familiar. Thus, the dreaded concentration of local power was realized after all, but not until Chase was able to walk away from the deal with most of its losses covered. First Pennsylvania Bank. Okay, here goes the broken record. In 1980, bailout of First Pennsylvania Bank of Philadelphia was next. With assets in excess of $9 billion, it was 6 times the size of Commonwealth. It also was the nation's oldest bank, dating back to the Bank of North America, which was created by the Continental Congress in 1978. The bank had experienced rapid growth and handsome profits due to the aggressive leadership of its CEO, John Bunting, formerly an economist with the Federal Reserve. He was the epitome of the era's go-go bankers. He vastly increased earnings by reducing safety margins, making risky loans, and speculating in the bond market. As long as the economy expanded, these gambles were profitable. When the bond market turned sour, however, the bank plunged into a negative cash flow. By 1979, First Penn was forced to sell off several of its profitable subsidiaries to obtain operating funds, and it was carrying $329 million in bad loans. That was $16 million more than the total investment from stockholders. The time had arrived to hit up taxpayers for the loss. for the loss. The bankers went to Washington to present their case. Not only was the bailout of First Penn essential for the continuation of banking services in Philadelphia, it was also critical to the preservation of world economic stability. The bank was so large, they said, if it were allowed to fall, it would act as the first domino leading to an international financial crisis. Sprague recalls, there was a strong pressure from the beginning not to let the bank fall, or not to let the bank fail. Besides hearing from the bank itself, the other large banks and the comptroller, we heard frequently from the Fed. I recall at one session, Fred Schultz, the Fed deputy chairman, argued in an ever-rising voice that there were no alternatives. We had to save the bank. He said, quit wasting time talking about anything else. And that quote was from Sprague, page 88 and 89. The directors of the FDIC did not want to cross swords with the Federal Reserve System, and they most assuredly did not want to be blamed for tumbling the entire world economic system by allowing the first domino to fall. So, in due course, a bailout package was put together, which featured a $325 million loan from FDIC, interest-free for the first year and at a subsidized rate thereafter, about half the market rate. Continental Illinois. In the early 1980s, Chicago's Continental Illinois was the nation's seventh largest bank, with assets of $42 billion and with 12,000 employees. Its loan portfolio had undergone spectacular growth. Its net income on loans had doubled in just 5 years, and by 1980 had rocketed to an annual figure of $254 million. It had become the darling of the market analysts and had been named by Dunn's Review as one of the 5 best managed companies in the country. These opinion leaders failed to perceive that the spectacular performance was due not to expertise in banking or investment, but to financing shaky business enterprises and foreign governments that could not obtain loans elsewhere. The gaudy fabric began to unravel during the 4th of July weekend of 1982 with the failure of the Penn Square Bank in Oklahoma. That was the notorious shopping center bank that had booked $1 billion in oil and gas loans and resold them to Continental just before the collapse of the energy market. Other loans also began to sour at the same time. Sorry. Little pause there. The Mexican and Argentine debt crisis was coming to a head, and a series of major corporate bankruptcies were receiving almost daily headlines. Continental had placed large chunks of its easy money with all of them. When these events caused the bank's credit rating to drop, cautious depositors began to withdraw their funds, and new funding dwindled to a trickle. The bank became desperate for cash to meet its daily expenses. In an effort to attract new money, it began to offer unrealistically high rates of interest on its CDs. Loan officers were sent to scour the European and Japanese markets to conduct a public relations campaign aimed at convincing market managers that the bank was calm and steady. David Taylor, the bank's chairman at the time, said, "We had the Continental Illinois Reassurance Brigade, and we fanned out all over the world." Quoted by Chernow, page 657. By the end of 1983, the bank's burden of non-performing loans had reached unbearable proportions and was growing at an alarming rate. By 1984, it was $2.7 billion. That same year, the bank sold off its profitable credit card operation to make up for the loss of income and to pay stockholders their expected quarterly dividend. The internal structure was near collapse, but the external facade continued to look like business as usual. The first crack in the facade appeared at 1930. The first crack in the facade appeared at 11:39 a.m. on Tuesday. Oh, okay, got it. Start again. The first crack in the facade appeared at 11:39 a.m. On Tuesday, May 8, Reuters, the British news agency, moved a story on its wire service stating that banks in the Netherlands, West Germany, Switzerland, and Japan had increased their interest rates on loans to Continental and that some of them had begun to withdraw their funds. The story also quoted that the bank's official statement that rumors of pending bankruptcy were totally preposterous. World's first electronic bank run. As the sun rose the following morning, foreign investors began to withdraw their deposits. $1 billion in Asian money moved out the first day. The next day, a little more than 24 hours following Continental's assurance that bankruptcy was totally preposterous, its long-standing customer, the Board of Trade Clearing Corporation, withdrew $50 million. Word of the defection spread through the financial wire services, and the panic was on. It became the world's first global electronic bank run. By Friday, the bank had been forced to borrow $3.6 billion from the Federal Reserve in order to cover escaping deposits. A consortium of 16 banks, led by Morgan Guaranty, offered a generous 30-day line of credit, but all of this was far short of the need. Within 7 more days, the outflow surged to over $6 billion. In the beginning, almost all of this action was at the institutional level. Other banks and professionally managed funds, which closely monitor every minuscule detail of the financial markets. The general public had no inkling of the catastrophe, even as it unfolded. Chernow says the Continental run was like some modernistic fantasy. There were no throngs of hysterical depositors, just cool nightmare flashes on computer screens. And that quote was from Chernow, page 658. Sprague writes, inside the bank, all was calm. The teller lines moved as always, and bank officials recall no visible sign of trouble, except in the wire room, where the employees knew what was happening as withdrawal order after order moved on the wire, bleeding Continental to death. Some cried. That was from Sprague, page 153. From the beginning, there was only one serious question: how to justify fleecing the taxpayer to save the bank. Oh my gosh, fleecing the taxpayer. What a word. The rules of the game require, it's probably a pretty accurate word to use. Anyways, fleecing. Okay, the rules of the game require that the scam must be described as a heroic effort to protect the public. In the case of Continental, the sheer size of the numbers made the ploy relatively easy. There were so many depositors involved, so many billions at risk, so many other banks interlocked. It would be claimed that the economic fabric of the entire nation, of the world itself, was at stake. And who could say that it was not so? Sprague argues the case in familiar terms. The early morning meeting was scheduled for Tuesday, May 15th at the Fed. We talked over the alternatives. They were few, none really. Treasury Secretary Reagan and Fed Chairman Volcker raised the familiar concern about a national banking collapse. That is, a chain reaction if Continental should fall or should fail. Volcker was worried about an international crisis. We all were acutely aware that never before had a bank even remotely approaching Continental size closed. No one knew what might happen in the nation and in the world. It was no time to find out just for the purpose of intellectual curiosity. Intellectual curiosity. That was from IBIT, page 154 to 55, and page 183. This was the golden moment for which the Federal Reserve and the FDIC were created. Without government intervention, Continental would have collapsed. Its stockholders would have been wiped out. Depositors would have been badly damaged, and the financial world would have learned that banks, not only have to talk about prudent management, they actually have to do it. Future banking practices would have been severely altered, and the long-term economic benefit of the nation and world would have been enormous. But with government intervention, the discipline of a free market is suspended, and the cost of failure and fraud is passed to the taxpayers. Depositors continue to live in a dream world of false security, and banks can operate recklessly and fraudulently with the knowledge that their political partners will come to their rescue when they get into trouble. And we will stop here for now. We'll start with part 2 next week. Oh, that was very interesting. I hope you enjoyed that. And thank you for tuning in and for joining us. And we will continue next time. Next week. Oops. Oops. All right. I hope you guys all have a good day, and we'll see you guys next week. Bye-bye now.